There are stories from the Second World War that history books remember in bold print. The battles, the generals, the turning points that shaped nations. But tucked between those grand chapters, there exists a quieter story. A story not of strategy or politics, but of friendship, of loyalty, of an unlikely bond formed between exhausted soldiers and an orphaned bear cub, somewhere on a dusty road between Siberia and Persia. This is the story of Wojtek. To understand how a bear came to wear a Polish military uniform, we must first understand the world that made such impossible things possible. September 1930–9. Poland found itself caught between two giants. From the west came Hitler's Wehrmacht, rolling across the border with mechanized fury. And just 17 days later, from the east, Stalin's Red Army advanced to claim their share. Poland, a nation that had only regained its independence 20 years earlier, was being carved apart once again. Over 400,000 Polish soldiers and civilians were captured by Soviet forces. Many were sent to labor camps scattered across Siberia, that frozen wilderness where winters lasted 8 months and hope was a luxury few could afford. These men worked, they suffered, they waited. And then, in 1941, everything changed. Hitler betrayed Stalin. German forces poured into the Soviet Union, and suddenly, the enemy of Poland's enemy needed friends. An agreement was reached. Those Polish prisoners, the ones who had survived the camps, were to be released. They would form a new army and join the fight against Nazi Germany. Thousands of weakened, malnourished men began a long march southward, through Kazakhstan, through Uzbekistan, through the mountain passes of Persia. They were heading toward the Middle East, where they would regroup, rebuild, and eventually return to the war. It was on this journey, somewhere in the hills of Iran, that fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Picture the scene. A column of tired soldiers, still bearing the marks of captivity on their gaunt faces, making their way along a mountain road. The year is 1942. These men have already survived more than most people endure in a lifetime. And there, by the roadside, stands a young Iranian shepherd boy. He carries a burlap sack, and inside that sack, something moves. The soldiers gather around, curious. The boy opens the sack, and there, blinking in the sudden light, is a Syrian brown bear cub, small enough to hold in your arms. Soft fur the color of summer wheat, eyes dark and frightened. The cub's mother had been killed by hunters. The boy had found the orphan alone, hungry, and terrified. He had been caring for it as best he could, but he had little to offer. One of the soldiers, a young man named Pyotr, made a decision. He traded a few tins of food, perhaps a knife, perhaps some coins. The exact exchange has been lost to time, but the result was clear. The bear cub now belonged to the 2nd Polish Corps. They named him Wojtek. In Polish, it means joyful warrior, or he who enjoys war. It was meant as a joke, of course. This tiny, helpless creature knew nothing of war. But he would learn. The care of young Wojtek fell primarily to a soldier named Henryk Zakharowicz. From the very beginning, a bond formed between man and bear that would last the rest of their days together. In those early weeks, Wojtek was fed condensed milk from an old vodka bottle. The soldiers fashioned a nipple from cloth and took turns holding the bottle as the cub nursed. They kept him warm at night, letting him sleep in their tents, sometimes curled against their chests. Imagine these battle-hardened men, survivors of Soviet labor camps, now fussing over feeding schedules and making sure a bear cub stayed warm through the desert nights. War does strange things to the human heart. It hardens some parts, but it also opens others, creates spaces for tenderness that peacetime never demands. Wojtek grew quickly. Within months, he was too large to carry. Within a year, he stood as tall as the men who cared for him. A full-grown Syrian brown bear can weigh over 500 pounds and stand nearly 5 feet at the shoulder. But Wojtek never seemed to understand that he was a bear. He had been raised among humans. He ate what they ate. He slept where they slept. He learned their habits, their routines, their games. When the soldiers wrestled for entertainment, Wojtek joined in, remarkably gentle for a creature of his size and strength. He understood somehow that these were his family, and families do not truly hurt one another. He developed a taste for beer. The soldiers would pour some into a basin, and Wojtek would lap it up, then look around expectantly for more. He also enjoyed cigarettes, though not in the way you might expect. He would take a lit cigarette, puff on it once or twice, then swallow it whole. The men found this endlessly amusing. Wojtek seemed pleased by their laughter. These moments of levity were precious. War is mostly waiting, punctuated by terror. The waiting is its own kind of hardship. And in those long stretches between battles, Wojtek gave the men something rare and valuable. He gave them joy. By 1943, the Polish Corps had been reorganized and trained. They were being deployed to Italy, where some of the war's fiercest fighting awaited them. But there was a problem. Military transport ships did not allow animals. Regulations were clear. Mascots, pets, personal companions of any kind were forbidden aboard vessels carrying troops to combat zones. The men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company faced an impossible choice. They could follow orders and leave their beloved Wojtek behind, or they could find another way. They chose another way. The paperwork was filed with a mixture of audacity and sincerity that only soldiers possess. Wojtek was formally enlisted in the Polish army. He was given a rank, private. He was assigned a serial number. He was issued a paybook, just like any other soldier. On paper, Wojtek was no longer a bear. He was a member of the Polish armed forces with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. And so, when the company boarded the transport ship bound for Italy, Wojtek walked up the gangway alongside his fellow soldiers. The British officers supervising the boarding looked on with bemusement, but the documents were in order. There was nothing to be done. Private Wojtek was going to war. The Battle of Monte Cassino remains one of the most brutal engagements of the Second World War. A medieval monastery sat atop a steep hill in central Italy, controlling the road to Rome. The Germans had fortified the position magnificently. Allied forces had already launched 3 major assaults, and 3 times they had been thrown back with devastating casualties. In May of 1944, the Fourth Battle of Monte Cassino began. Polish forces were given one of the most dangerous assignments: to assault the heights directly, through terrain that favored defenders at every turn. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was responsible for moving ammunition to the front lines. This was not a safe job conducted far from danger. The supply routes were under constant artillery fire. German shells fell without warning, turning trucks and men into scattered wreckage. It was during this battle that Wojtek did something remarkable. Henryk Zakharowicz had been called forward as an artillery spotter, leaving Wojtek behind with the ammunition crews. The bear watched as the men around him worked frantically, lifting heavy crates of shells, carrying them to the waiting guns. And then Wojtek began to help. He rose onto his hind legs, approached the stacks of ammunition crates, and lifted one. These crates weighed over 100 pounds each. Wojtek carried them as easily as a man might carry a loaf of bread. He walked to where the shells were needed, set down his load, and returned for another. The shells continued to fall. The noise was tremendous. Men dove for cover. But Wojtek kept working, moving through the chaos with a strange calm, as if he understood that this was important, that his family needed him. No one ordered him to do this. No one trained him for it. He simply saw what needed to be done, and he did it. When the battle finally ended, when the monastery had fallen and the road to Rome lay open, the survivors of the 22nd Company gathered to honor their comrades, both human and otherwise. They commissioned a new unit insignia. It depicted a bear standing upright, carrying an artillery shell. That image would remain the official emblem of the 22nd Transport Company for the rest of the war and for decades afterward. Wojtek had earned his place among them, not as a mascot, not as a curiosity, as a soldier. The war ended in May of 1945, but for the Polish soldiers who had fought so hard, peace brought its own sorrows. Poland had been liberated from Nazi occupation, but it had not been freed. Soviet forces now controlled the country, installing a communist government that answered to Moscow. For many Polish soldiers in the West, returning home meant risking arrest, imprisonment, or worse. The men of the 22nd Company were relocated to Scotland, to a camp near the village of Hutton in Berwickshire. There they waited to learn what the future would hold. Wojtek waited with them. One by one, the soldiers received their discharges. Some emigrated to Canada, to Australia, to America. Some found ways to return to Poland despite the risks. Some remained in Britain, building new lives in a country far from home. Each departure meant another goodbye. Wojtek seemed to sense the sadness of these partings. He would sit quietly as the men he had known for years knelt beside him, speaking softly in Polish, scratching behind his ears one final time. In 1947, the inevitable arrived. The army camp was closing. There was no place for a bear in civilian life, no home large enough, no garden secure enough, no family equipped to care for a 500-pound soldier who happened to have fur. Wojtek was transferred to the Edinburgh Zoo. The Edinburgh Zoo was not unkind. Wojtek had a spacious enclosure. He was fed well and cared for by professionals who understood his needs. But he was alone. The keepers noticed that Wojtek behaved differently from other bears. He did not fear humans. He sought them out. When visitors gathered at his enclosure, he would approach the barrier and stand on his hind legs, reaching out with his paws, as if expecting an embrace that never came. He responded in Polish. When someone called his name with the proper pronunciation, his ears would perk up. When someone spoke to him in the language of his youth, he would grow calm, attentive, almost hopeful. Word spread among the Polish community in Scotland. Veterans of the Italian campaign began making pilgrimages to Edinburgh. They would stand at Wojtek's enclosure, speaking to him in Polish, sometimes tossing him cigarettes, which he would still accept and swallow with the same enthusiasm as before. Augustin Karolewski, one of the original soldiers who had known Wojtek since Iran, visited regularly until his own health failed. He described these reunions in simple terms. He remembered us. When I spoke his name, he would sit up and shake his head, wanting a cigarette. He was still one of the boys. Wojtek passed away in December of 1963. He was 21 years old, a respectable age for a bear, though perhaps not long enough for those who loved him. The news of his death made papers across Britain and Poland. Condolences arrived from veterans' organizations around the world. A small notation appeared in the official records of the Polish army, marking the passing of Private Wojtek, serial number unknown, cause of death, natural causes. He was buried at the Edinburgh Zoo. In the years since Wojtek's death, his story has only grown. Statues stand in his honor in Edinburgh, in London, in Krakow, in the village of Zadin, where Polish armored units once trained. Each depicts him as he was at Monte Cassino, upright, strong, carrying a shell to the guns. Schools in Scotland bear his name. Books have been written about his life, documentaries have been filmed. His image appears on murals, on memorial plaques, on the badges worn by Polish veterans associations. But perhaps what matters most is not the bronze or the ink. What matters is what Wojtek represented to the men who knew him. In the midst of humanity's darkest chapter, when cruelty and destruction seemed limitless, a group of exhausted soldiers found space in their hearts for an orphaned bear. They fed him when food was scarce. They protected him when danger surrounded them. They loved him not because he was useful, but because love was the one thing the war could not take from them. And Wojtek loved them back, without condition, without complexity, with the pure, uncomplicated devotion that only an animal can offer. He reminded them that gentleness still existed, that joy was still possible, that even in the shadow of death, life insists on moments of grace. The soldiers who survived the war carried many burdens, memories of fallen friends, the weight of things seen and done, the sorrow of a homeland lost to new occupiers. But they also carried Wojtek not as a burden, but as a blessing, a reminder that they had been capable of kindness when kindness was hardest, that they had found family when family seemed impossible, that they had known joy in the midst of sorrow. Wojtek was a bear who went to war. That sentence alone sounds like the beginning of a children's story, something whimsical and impossible. But there was nothing whimsical about the mud of Monte Cassino. Nothing impossible about the courage of the men who fought there. Nothing fictional about the bond between a soldier named Henrik and a bear named Wojtek. It happened. All of it. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing of all. In a world that had lost its mind, in a century that seemed determined to prove humanity's capacity for destruction, a brown bear from the mountains of Iran carried artillery shells through enemy fire, drank beer with his comrades, and lived out his final years waiting for old friends to visit. Some stories remind us of what we are capable of at our worst. This story reminds us of what we are capable of at our best. His name was Wojtek. He was a soldier. He was a friend. And he was loved.